Good evening, Rifters. Before I get into talking about mega damage capacity, I wanted to make a correction regarding my previous video about structural damage capacity. It was brought to my attention in the comments that the original iteration of the Palladium fantasy game, characters only had hit points and SDC was solely for objects, which in retrospect makes sense, since when you think about it, structural damage would apply to, well, structures. And as it turns out, by the second edition, the Palladium fantasy game, SDC for characters was added in retroactively, so I apologize for that oversight. With that said, let's lock and load and get on with talking about MDC. Mega Damage Capacity, or MDC, as it will be referred to going forward, is one of the most divisive and polarizing game mechanics in all of Rifts, maybe even of all time in gaming. Here's a brief overview of exactly how MDC compares to SDC. It's a pretty simple equation. 100 SDC points equals 1 MDC point. MDC is not inherently immune to SDC damage, it's just resistant to it. In order to do 1 point of MDC damage with an SDC gun, you need at least 100 points of SDC damage to the object in a single attack. The same is true in reverse. If you do only 1 MD point to any SDC object, it converts to 100 SDC points. It is possible to do minor damage to some MDC structures with SDC weapons, particularly high-end particle weapons and explosives. If you launch a grenade that can do 1d4 times 100 SDC damage, for example, you could do between 1 and 4 damage to any MDC object. For MDC vehicles and power armor, this is at best a minor inconvenience. On the same token, if you have a high SDC object like a normal car or a juicer character which can have between 100 and 400 SDC points, they could easily live through a small arms attack like a puny laser gun that can only do 1d4 MDC. It sounds good in theory, but in practice it has led to many criticisms and outright arguments over the failure of the system, so much so that people have completely house-ruled it out of the game at best, and many have outright refused to play the game at all because of it. But why is it put in the game in the first place? Where did it even come from? If you played any of the early Palladium games, MDC seemed hardly to be present at all. That is up until the Macross or Robotech games. When Macross was launched in the early 80s, the system was introduced to make the futuristic tech and giant mechs of that era so advanced that the kind of gear and weapons we understand today in the modern world pales before it. As SDC was originally intended to represent objects and not people, so too was MDC. It makes perfect sense. When you're playing a sci-fantasy game like Robotech, those giant transforming robots wouldn't be bothered by pesky human firearms. On the same token, if you were to get shot by one of those giant mega damage weapons, you'd be pasted in a fast second. The example from the original Macross books explained this perfectly, as it related to someone beating a tank, which is an MDC vehicle, with a baseball bat, throwing rocks at it, and shooting it with a machine gun, while the tank just sits there taking 0 damage. Then, all of a sudden, some guys roll up in a car with a bazooka, takes a shot, and actually does a few measly MDC points to the tank, which responds in kind by firing a shell at the normal SDC car and leaving it a heaping pile of burning, twisted metal. In a vacuum, it seems, to me at least, to make perfect sense. But as with many games, and the Palladium Unified System especially, as more books and supplements were introduced, more add-ons and duct tape was added to the system, introducing levels of power creep in each new release of content. So, fast forward to Rifts, and you've got a tweaked version of the MDC system, where it not only affects large-scale futuristic hardware, but small arms, like laser pistols, body armor, and supernatural monsters and creatures from various dimensions. The reasoning is that since Earth is now drowned in the ley line energy, anything that was once a mundane supernatural entity has been bathed in the energies to such a point that they are as powerful as humanity's most powerful technology. This makes ordinary humans almost insect-like beneath the feet of almost everything around them. There are a lot of occupational character classes to choose from in Rifts, and in the first book it wasn't so bad. You could be a rogue scholar, and still carry an MDC sidearm and wear some armor that could at least absorb a few hits from MDC weapons. The idea in these cases would be to avoid head-on combat as much as possible, like any other support class. But meanwhile, you have a party member in a Glitter Boy power armor suit walking around like not just a tank, but a battalion of tanks, taking fire from all directions and shooting a weapon that could level a building in a single shot. This has inevitably led to the contention by a lot of people that the system is simply broken and unplayable because the only way to thrive in the game is to gear up and choose a class with the most powerful builds. This, to some, has put the role-playing on the back burner and led to some disappointment. I did want to point out, though, that the idea of normal humans being in MDC situations isn't new, not even in some of our favorite fiction. Look at Star Trek. Those phasers they carry generally have 3 settings: stun, kill, and maximum damage. To translate this into Rift's mechanics, let's look at each increment. The stun setting is clearly a non-lethal setting. When they fire the weapon, the target they hit must make a saving throw of 16 or higher, as with the neural mace and non-lethal poison, or be stunned. Multiple hits will render them unconscious. Then the phaser strikes the target on a low-level kill setting. They are simply burned and can suffer fatal wounds, but aren't necessarily going to die in a single hit. It would be no different than any other SDC combat damage where characters would be encouraged to get behind and shoot from behind cover. Then you have the maximum setting, a setting that would simply vaporize any normal humanoid target in 1 or 2 hits. Unless the target has any protection, such as Borg shields, not to be confused with the Rift's cyborgs, of course, odds are there's not going to be anything left to even know someone was killed, outside of some DNA residue that a medical tricorder could detect. And if you've ever seen movies like Starship Troopers or War of the Worlds 2, which is effectively Rifts without magic, you can see firsthand how humans can both cope with and be affected by MDC attacks. Unfortunately, as more books came out with character options that include a multitude of MDC creatures, it makes the original idea of the struggle of humanity a scary place kind of obsolete, and the playing field became so equal that MDC is now the default, and SDC is almost completely irrelevant and hardly ever used in some games. The main takeaway I have with this is that it can still be a lot of fun to play in the MDC world of Rifts, but I think what needs to be done to make it work is a session 0 where both the GM and the players decide on the tone of the game they want to play and set boundaries that can allow players to be on par with each other. By doing that, the GM can now set the tone of the setting so the world can be on par with them. Rifts is an amazing setting, and it can definitely be overwhelming, but remember, if the group is all on the same page, they can spend an entire campaign somewhere in the Midwest, where things like the Coalition are just a distant tale that the occasional wastelander who made it across the barren and unforgiving landscape wanders into town with. Not unlike how each of the Fallout games focus on a niche location, with plenty to do there. I hope this information was helpful, and if I got anything wrong, which is highly possible, please let me know in the comments. Until next time, Rogue Scholar out.